Hi everyone, Corie here, and we're continuing to read through the Bible this year. This week's assigned reading was in Nehemiah, starting in chapter 1, to Job chapter 3. So we're going through Nehemiah, Esther, and just scratching the surface of the wisdom book of Job. Okay, let's recap these chapters. If you're interested in reading through the Bible with me and you've never done it before, check out all of the links in the description box below to BibleDiscoveryTV.com. You can get a Bible guide. It comes to you new every month, and it has a daily devotional and assigned reading for you. That way, we're going to get you all the way from Genesis to Revelation in a year. Okay, Nehemiah chapter 1. Let's do a recap here. Okay, so Nehemiah, to open up this book, this book occurs in time just after the return of Ezra, the priest, and the rebuilding of the temple in the city of Jerusalem. And it appears that the exiles had tried to rebuild the wall as they were also rebuilding the temple, but they'd been stopped. You can look back to Ezra chapter 4 for why they had been held up in their accomplishment of building the walls and the temple. So Nehemiah, he begins to pray. We're going to be starting chapter 1 now. The official recap. We've introed the book, and now here's chapter 1. So Nehemiah begins to pray, appealing to God's word. So looking back to the promise that God made through Moses just after the Exodus, this covenant that he made with the Israelites, that, you know, even if they were exiled because of their sins against God in the covenant, if the people humbled themselves and prayed, if they came back around to God and dedicated themselves to him, that he would bring them back to Jerusalem and restore them as a people in the land. So Nehemiah begins to appeal God to that end. We also learn that Nehemiah is in Susa, which was a summer capital city of the Persian empires. It was the Persian Empire, singular. It was one of the capital cities, all right? So Nehemiah is the cupbearer to Persian King Artaxerxes. So he's a very high up trusted official to King Artaxerxes. And it should be noted here that many of the exiles did really well in the Babylonian exile and the Persian captivity. We see this throughout a few books of the Bible, but not the least, which is here in Nehemiah. So many of them, remember, didn't want to go back with Ezra. Ezra had to call on some of the Levites and the priests to actually come back with him. They wanted to stay because some of them had become very well established. Okay, Nehemiah 2. So Nehemiah is feeling this way, and he has to risk going before the king and asking the king about this whole Jerusalem situation, because the walls in Jerusalem, they aren't built, and Nehemiah is very upset about this. So he risks mourning in the presence of the king. He doesn't do up his face. He doesn't try to look happy. He doesn't try to look professional. He drops all of that. And it even says in chapter 2, Nehemiah actually records, I was very much afraid. He knew how dangerous this was. And Nehemiah asks the king not only to be sent to Jerusalem, this obscure province in the Persian Empire, but to rebuild the walls and the gates of the capital city of Jerusalem. He asks for letters from the king for safe travel and for building materials, for a place for him to live, for lumber for the gates. So this was building materials, wood in particular, because wood was a hot commodity. There was a lot of stone, a lot of mud, but not a lot of trees that were big enough for use in mass building projects. Now, the king not only did all of this for Nehemiah, he also sent him with a royal guard to accompany him. So military officers and cavalry went with Nehemiah. So when Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem, still in chapter 2, this must have been a very impressive entourage. And no one knew what Nehemiah was doing. No one knew why he was there. So all of a sudden this Jewish official, this Persian Jewish official comes riding in with a military accompaniment into the city of Jerusalem that has this recently rebuilt temple. So Nehemiah rests for 3 days, and then he goes out by night to inspect the wall and the gates, the ruins of it. He hasn't told anyone his mission yet. And we're told that there is opposition by Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, who we've met previously in Ezra, and Tobiah, who was definitely official, perhaps a governor of Ammon. Okay, chapter 3. Nehemiah's mission, his plot to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem is now known, and there's a list of who was building what section of the wall. So men and their sons and their daughters, who did what where. That's chapter 3. Chapter 4, Sanballat and Tobiah actually plan to attack Jerusalem, but word reaches Nehemiah. People tell Nehemiah about this plot. So the people begin to build the wall of Jerusalem while wearing weapons. They appoint lookouts and a trumpeter who would have different sounds to alert people of, in case of an attack, which area of the wall to all rush to, because they were really separated. They were all spread out around this massive wall of Jerusalem trying to rebuild it all at the same time. So it left them really vulnerable to attack. But because their plan was found out, Sanballat doesn't end up attacking, which is great. Chapter 5, we learn that Nehemiah had actually been made governor of Judah by Artaxerxes, the Persian king. So he was given this new post. And we also learn in chapter 5 that the wealthy returned exiles were not helping the poorer returned exiles. Actually, they were making it worse. They were taking their property, their fields, their food, all of their wealth, and forcing them essentially into debt slavery. And once you were a debt slave, it was very difficult to get out of this debt slavery because they already owned all of your fields and your vineyards, the way that you would get wealth. So it's a very difficult thing to escape from. So Nehemiah is horrified by this, and he makes them stop. He calls them out. He shames them, and he demands mercy. He demands that the wealthy exiles release the poor exiles, that they give their land back. And he says, for the sake of the covenant of God, God has just released us from exile. Why would we be re-enslaving our brothers and sisters? We also learned that Nehemiah had been personally redeeming Israelites, meaning he was paying the debt of them to the people who they owed money to, and he demanded their property and interest be given back to them. We also learned that as the governor, Nehemiah did not tax the people of Judah for food as he normally would have, but he provided food out of his own wealth. Okay, Nehemiah chapter 6, the wall is finished, but there's no gates at this point. And Sanballat and Tobiah, who we learn is very well connected, he's got influence over the residents of the land, including in Jerusalem. So Sanballat, Tobiah, and a man named Geshem hatch a plot to assassinate Nehemiah. But Nehemiah has their number. He's not going to meet with them. Finally, they try to blackmail him. They say, if you don't come meet with us, we're going to tell the king of Persia that you're planning on naming yourself king of Jerusalem and you're planning this big rebellion and revolt. That doesn't work either. Nehemiah's not scared of that because he knows it's not true. So when that doesn't work, they actually hire a prophet in Jerusalem, a false prophet, to tell Nehemiah that there's an attack that's coming and he needs to hole himself up on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount had its own separate gated area, so sometimes it's referred to as the Citadel. It was like a secondary safe place in the city. Go lock yourself up. But Nehemiah won't do it. He won't hide. He doesn't have anything to hide from, and it would have looked really bad had he had gone up and holed himself up in the Citadel. He would have looked guilty. We also learned that there was quite a few prophets prophesying bad things about Nehemiah and trying to get him trapped, but nevertheless, the wall of Jerusalem gets finished in 52 days. And if you visit Jerusalem today, part of the wall of Nehemiah has actually been excavated. You can even look it up just on an internet search engine, Wall of Nehemiah. You can see the remains of it still standing to this day. Okay, Nehemiah chapter 7, they put in the gates of the city, so the doors for the gates, and Nehemiah reinstitutes the system of gatekeepers and musicians and Levites and commanders and all of these good things that David had put into place. David, second king of Israel, who was making arrangements for the temple. There's also a list of people who had come back from the exile, and Nehemiah, we learn, is looking for people to come and repopulate Jerusalem, because the Temple Mount is done, the wall is rebuilt, but there's not a whole lot of people living there, and all the residential areas of the city are still, in tatters. They haven't been rebuilt since the Babylonian destruction. Chapter 8, there's this gathering of Israel at one of the gates in the city, and Ezra the priest reads from the book of the law, the books of Moses, and he reads it for all the people to hear. And interestingly, there's 13 Levites surrounding him that help explain the law to the people. And the wording's a bit awkward in English. He's reading it and then they're helping to explain it. But a lot of people think that this probably means that the Levites were actually translating the Bible for the people. You got to think about it. The Torah was written in Hebrew, but these people have been living in Persia, in a land where Aramaic is being spoken. This is where they've been living. This is where they had been raised. This is where they've been doing their business. So it's very possible that the Levites were actually translating the words that Ezra was saying, because perhaps only the religious, the families of the Levites and the priests, as Ezra were and the Levites were, actually kept their Hebrew language, up to snuff. Okay, the people began to weep as they heard the words that Ezra was reading, but the Levites and Ezra told them not to weep. This is actually a time of celebration. So they began to weep because they were hearing the law of God and how far their people had fallen from the original covenant. But they end up celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. And there's each day of the 7-day festival, Ezra reads from the law for quite a long time. So really interesting chapter. Chapter 9, after the Feast of Tabernacles, they have a day of mourning. This is the time to mourn and confess your national sins and your personal sins. And there's a record here of, there's a recording of the Levites' prayer of praise. And it goes back through a summary of the history of Israel. And it ends very interestingly. It ends with a recognition that the Israelites, these returned exiles, are still slaves. They're still subservient to Persia. They do not have a king of David on their throne. So, in light of that fact, they renew the covenant with God. So that is all in chapter 9. Chapter 10, there's a list of people who sealed. They gave their authority to this written covenant. And then the people, men, women, and it's noted, and children who were old enough to understand, vow to follow the law of God. And there's specific things that are mentioned in their case, not only just the general law of God, but that specifically they will not enact unlawful marriages with other religions. They will keep the Sabbath day and the Sabbath year where they're supposed to return slaves, debt slaves. And there's this responsibility. They're going to have this responsibility for the upkeep of the temple, and they are going to tithe to keep it running. Chapter 11, the leaders of Israel are settled in Jerusalem, and then lots, so essentially dice, or the Urim and Thummim, were rolled to bring 1 out of every 10 families, returned families, into Jerusalem. And some of these families are volunteered, and they were very highly praised for that. They volunteered themselves. Not they were kind of told to volunteer. They volunteered themselves. Okay. There's a list of leaders given that settled in Jerusalem, and then also some of the cities and villages that were resettled in Judah are also mentioned here. Chapter 12, there's a list, more lists. This is very important. These were real people, so this was very important for them to record it all for posterity. So there's a list of the priests and Levites who had returned, and then in the second half of chapter 12, we get this dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, this big celebration. And what Nehemiah does is he arranges 2 choirs with musical instruments and leaders of the people, and Ezra follows one and Nehemiah follows the other, and they start at one section of the wall and they walk all the way around the wall singing praise until they meet up at the temple, in which they go down at one of the gates, right? And they have this big service in the temple complex with praise and sacrifices and everything like that. Chapter 13, the last chapter of Nehemiah, we learned that Nehemiah had gone back to Persia to work with the Persian king for a time, and when he came back to Jerusalem, everything seems to have been in a bit of chaos. So Tobiah, enemy Tobiah, had managed to get a storeroom in the temple cleared out for himself. And Nehemiah wasn't having any of this. He marches into the temple and he has all of Tobiah's personal belongings thrown out of the temple, and he purifies the room. We learn that the Levites who had been working in the temple had not been given their portions of food, their payment, and so they had to go home to their fields to cultivate their fields in order to live. So Nehemiah reorganizes the temple again. Essentially, he fires people and then rehires more respectable people to make them in charge. And then he also finds out that people had been buying and selling on the Sabbath in Jerusalem. So how he deals with this is he orders that every Sabbath, the gates of Jerusalem remain shut. No one can come in, no one can go out. He just enforces this rule. He also learns that people have been marrying foreign women, and the Bible says that half of the children that were married to them didn't even speak Aramaic or Hebrew. They were not being raised in the covenant of the God of Israel that the people had just signed. So Nehemiah rebukes some of them. Pretty brutally, it sounds like he beats some of the men, and he talks to them about King Solomon. Not even the wisest king in the world, in the history of Israel, could not be snared by this. He got caught up in this. What makes you think that you're wiser and smarter and better than King Solomon? Okay, and that is the end of the book of Nehemiah. So that brings us to Esther. Esther is a surprisingly controversial book. Esther brings us back into the exiles in the Persian Empire. So not everyone wanted to leave, right? And there's still exiles in the Persian Empire. What's really interesting about Esther, there's a few things, but one thing that I find really interesting is that no commentary is given on the motivations of the heroes in the story. So Esther's motivation and Mordecai's motivation. In the Kings and in the Chronicles, there'll be narrative inserts where it says, this king was bad, or this king was being prideful, or this king was being arrogant, or this king was being jealous. But with Esther and Mordecai, those motives aren't given. For example, does Esther object to becoming a concubine in the king's palace? We don't know. It's not said one way or the other if she cared or not. We're not told of any hesitancy, but we're not told of any preference either. Does Mordecai have a problem with this? We don't know. It's not talked about. And also Mordecai not bowing to Haman. Is this because of Mordecai's Jewish faith? He doesn't want to bow to another man? We don't know. Does he just not like Haman? Does he have political intrigue against Haman? We don't know. We're not told specifically. Most people think it's probably because of his Jewish faith that he doesn't bow to Haman, but the point is, we don't know. It's one of the reasons behind that is probably because the book seems to be seeking to reinforce that Israel is still God's people, even though they're in exile. So even though they're in a pagan and a foreign place of punishment, God is still moving. God is still working with Israel. The people still have a relationship with him, even though it's in a different way. It's exercised in a different way. It's more under the surface. It may not be entirely apparent, which is a very interesting theme throughout Esther. Okay, enough. Here we go. Esther chapter 1. Xerxes, the king of Persia, gets rid of his current queen, Vashti, for not obeying a drunken order to come in her royal crown and robes and be gazed upon by a room full of his drunken guests. So he calls for her to come. She doesn't come. He ousts her. She gets demoted back to his harem. She's no longer the queen. Esther chapter 2. Once Xerxes kind of sobers up, he regrets this later on, and so his officials decide to find him a beautiful new virgin queen. And here's where we meet Mordecai. He's some sort of official in Susa, and his cousin, who he has adopted as daughter when her parents die, her name is Esther or Hadassah, and she gets chosen as one of these beautiful virgins to go through beauty treatments and then go spend a night with the king. And if he likes her, she'll become queen, and if she's just okay, she'll go back into the king's harem. So Esther gets chosen out of the rounds of women, and she eventually becomes queen. But as Mordecai advises her, she does not disclose her nationality. Now, here's something interesting. In verse 19, it says this: when the virgins assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now, this is after Esther has already been declared queen. So this is a big question in a lot of people's minds. What's going on here? Why are the virgins rounded up a second time? Is this the same group of virgins that the king has already slept with, making them not virgins again? Or what's going on here? Is he doing this whole thing again, even though Esther's already queen? Maybe it's all of the women that were waiting to go visit the king, have a night with the king, but Esther went before them, and so she has already been chosen queen. So now perhaps they're being paraded around town to accentuate Esther's beauty. Look at all of these beautiful women that the king could have had, and instead he chose Esther. Okay, so how amazing Queen Esther must be. Maybe this is what's going on. While he's in the gate, Mordecai overhears an assassination plot. Someone's trying to kill the king. So he tells Esther, Esther tells the king tells the guards, and the assassination plot is foiled. The men that were trying to assassinate the king were impaled on poles. So pretty self-explanatory. Pole, body, impaled. It was horrible, but a method of punishment that was utilized in ancient Persia. Chapter 3, Haman. Here is Haman, the bad guy of the story. He is honored, and the king, he commands all of the officials to bow down before Haman, but Mordecai won't do it. Again, we're not told why. We're just told that he refuses to comply. So Haman is so angry that he comes up with an evil plan to kill Mordecai because he finds out Mordecai is a Jew. So he casts a dice to determine the date of Mordecai's extermination plan. Okay, he's gonna kill Mordecai and all of his people. So what's the date? Roll the dice. And this word, pur, is what the festival Purim, which celebrates this Esther event, is named after. So it's about the roll of the dice. And the whole concept here, I'm going to kind of spoil the story, so hopefully you've read it. The whole point of the story is that God determines Israel's future, not the dice roll of pagans, no matter how powerful they are. So, still in chapter 3, Haman offers to pay the king in order to destroy a group of people who, he says, they're bad for the kingdom, they have weird customs, and they don't obey your laws. So the king says, you know what? Keep your money. You don't have to pay me. Just exterminate them. Do whatever you want. So an edict is sent out to all of the provinces of Persia that on the date determined by Haman's dice, the people who don't like these people, who end up being the Jews, can kill them. The Jews can be killed in 11 months' time. Chapter 4, Mordecai instantly goes into mourning when this edict is read aloud. Esther hears about Mordecai mourning, but she doesn't really know what's going on. when Mordecai explains the plot, he asks Esther to intercede with the king. Go ask the king for help. But Esther does not want to do this. She hasn't been summoned to the king for 30 days. So to go before the king's presence when you're not summoned meant that you were probably going to die unless he was in a good mood and he extended his scepter to you. There was, about 7 men. When you look into Persian history, there was 7 men that were allowed to come and go in the king's presence, his top officials, and Haman was one of those men. So Haman had all of the authority in this situation, and Esther was going in and accusing him, of trying to kill her. So this was not a good situation for Esther to be in. Mordecai makes the only overt statement of faith in the entire book here. In chapter 4, verse 13 and 14, he says this: he sent back this answer to Esther. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. In other words, he's saying to Esther, fear God more than you fear the king and the king's advisors. Chapter 5, Esther risks her life by putting on her royal robes and going before the king uninvited. Note the irony here. It's clashing Esther with Vashti. Vashti risked her life by refusing to put on her royal robes, and she was invited to the king's presence, and she chose not to go. But now here Esther is putting on her royal robes, risking her life going before the king uninvited. So there's this really interesting irony here. Now, luckily the king's happy, and she's fine, and Esther invites the king and Haman to a banquet. Essentially, the concept here is, let me honor the king. Let me honor you, king, before I ask you for something. And she does this twice. He comes to dinner and she says, come to a banquet again. So he knows that whatever she's going to ask is going to be likely a big ask. Okay, on the way home from the first banquet, Haman sees Mordecai, who does not rise when he passes by, doesn't rise for out of respect, and Haman's wife suggests setting up a pole and asking the king for permission to impale Mordecai on it the next day. Chapter 6, the king cannot sleep, and so he has the royal records read to him, and in the royal records that night, the person reads about Mordecai and how he saved the king from an assassination plot, and the king realizes that Mordecai has not been repaid for that. In the morning, Haman comes to ask permission to execute Mordecai, and the king asks Haman, what should I do for a man that I want to honor? Haman thinks he's talking about him. So he says, put your royal robe on him and let him ride your royal horse. And then the king has Haman do that for Mordecai. So it's this reversal, this ironic reversal again. There's lots of irony throughout the book of Esther. Chapter 7, the second banquet, Esther finally tells the king, but she does it so delicately because, after all, this is the king's edict, right? He made this rule, and Esther can't blame the king. She doesn't want to die. So let me read you verse 3 to 4. She goes, if I found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request, for I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. When the king asks who would dare do this, because he's enraged, Esther has played her hand very well. She's been very charming. He's enraged, and Esther tells him it was Haman. The king leaves in a rage. Now, at this point, Haman also should have left the presence of Esther. He shouldn't have been alone with a royal wife, but he knew he was already dead. He knew it with the temperament of Xerxes, and so he stayed to beg, and he falls before Esther, who's reclining on this couch. And here's another irony, right? Mordecai wouldn't fall before Haman, but now Haman is falling before Esther. And when the king comes back in and sees Haman, falling on Esther, it enrages him even more. And a eunuch who's there tells the king that Haman has actually set up a pole to impale Mordecai on. And the king orders that Haman go and be impaled on this pole himself. So there's more of that irony. Chapter 8, Esther is given Haman's estate, and Mordecai is given the king's signet seal. So this is an official of rank. He is made an official of high rank in the king's palace, and Esther puts Mordecai over Haman's estate. Mordecai is able to write a counter edict. So Haman's edict had said that the enemies of the Jews could kill them on, such and such a day out of the year. And now Mordecai writes this edict with the king's authority that the Jews can defend themselves. There's great celebrations, and it's even said at the end of the chapter that some people in Persia even became Jews. They became proselytes because of the fear of the Jews had fallen on them. They thought this was such an amazing thing that had happened, that they believed in the God of Israel. Chapter 9, the day of battle essentially comes, and it says the nobles and the officials of the king actually helped the Jews because they were scared of Mordecai, who had risen to great power and great authority in Xerxes' palace. The Jews defend themselves in Susa, and Esther asks the king for an extension so that they can defend themselves another day. And it's noted that the Jews do defeat their enemies, but they do not take plunder. They don't loot the bodies or take possession of property or anything like that. Haman's sons are also impaled, and the festival of Purim, there's that word, that Purim is established. So again, God is in control of what happens to the Israelites, not the dice of pagans, no matter how powerful they are. In chapter 10, there's just this prologue. We learn that Mordecai rose to second in the kingdom of Xerxes. Okay, and that's Esther. We have just read through 2 books of the Bible. We are now going to focus our attention on Job, but we're just going to scratch the surface. We're just going to look at the first 3 chapters. Okay, Job. The book of Job is wisdom literature. It is written as poetry. It is all about the suffering of the innocent, the testing of the righteous, and man's relationship with God. So there's 3 huge themes that flow throughout this ancient poetry. Chapter 1, we meet Job, a wealthy man, a man who loved God, and a man who loved his family. Then we're kind of transported into this unearthly, heavenly meeting between the angels of God and the adversary, translated as Satan in our English Bible. He is engaged in dialogue by God, who brings up the example of Job, and Satan charges that Job only loves God because he's wealthy. He has a great family and many possessions. So God allows Satan to take all of that away. So in one day, Job loses his oxen and donkeys to attackers, his sheep and servants to a fire, his camels to raiders, and his children. His children die because of a natural disaster. A huge storm comes. So the response of Job to this in chapter 1 is to worship God in his grief. So he's not happy, but he's acknowledging God in his grief. This is the famous verse in the Bible. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. That's verse 21 of Job 1. Now, verse 22 importantly states, there's a sum up here. It says, in all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. And this is going to be stretched a little bit over the next several chapters. There's going to be a tension that develops. Okay, we learn here too, I just want to kind of point out in chapter 1, there's a theme right away in chapter 1 that strikes us. It's that it's not God's job to ensure that we are wealthy and that everything goes perfectly in our lives. So already this assumption is kind of swept off the table, and we're brought into a practical situation of someone who is righteous and yet loses everything that they have. Chapter 2, In heaven again, Satan charges that Job hasn't cursed God because he still has his health. He hasn't been pushed to his final limits. So then Job is afflicted from head to toe with painful sores. And his wife, Job's wife, has had it. She has had enough, and she ends up speaking for Satan. In verse 9 to 10, this is what happens. His wife says to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." And Job replied, "You're talking like a foolish woman. Should we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Okay, so then in the end of chapter 2, Job's friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar come to him and they mourn with him. They sit in silence for 7 days. And now here, chapter 3, the kind of poetic discourse begins. So in this big long poem of chapter 3, Job curses the day that he was born. He poses 2 rhetorical questions in this poem. 1, why was I even born? And 2, why does life remain in those who want to die? Why does God give them life still? So Job doesn't curse God, but he wants to die, and he's very confused about God's purposes. There's a part in the poem that says, "Why is life given to a man whose way is hidden?" It doesn't make sense. Whom God has hedged in. And the intimation here is God has hedged him in for a bad purpose, for a malicious purpose, almost to just torment me. What's going on? Job is clearly in a horrible state of mourning, and he just wants it to end, and he doesn't understand why God is not allowing him to just die. So it doesn't really end on a happy note, but that is Job chapter 3. That is where the end of our reading brings us this week. Next week, we are going full force into the book of Job and right into those themes of suffering, the testing of the righteous and man's relationship with God. So I hope that you are ready to go into some ancient poetry. It can be a little bit of a tricky read and a lot of a repetitive read, but it will be worth it. I promise. Leave comments and questions if you have anything that you want to ask about the reading that happened this week. Please write it down in the comments below and I will get to it. I'm currently making a couple videos based off of the questions from last week. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, everyone, for your questions from last week. I'm working on it right now. I'm very excited about it. I hope you have a good one. Talk to you later.